I think it's getting to the end of the day and we need a bit of light relief. I'm usually rolled out for this. So I'm going to talk about why I am worried, but we'll get to that gently. So the first thing, I always put something flashing if it's something I shouldn't forget to say. And that's basically, these are my own views, no one else's. I've put the slides are quite dark because it's quite a dark talk. I'm worried about AI, not as much as CRISPR, but we'll talk about that later. I'll put up this list because it makes all my opinions sound valid. But there's a bit of work we've done around machine learning as well, so I'll just take you through a bit of that. So this all started when I set up an NHS Code for Health community called Open Cancer, and that's all to do with information modeling, semantic interoperability, and it's what we've touched on previously. How do you actually relate what you find in the machine learning to what's going on in the patient? So we're talking about the patient phenotype, their symptoms, what they exhibit. And everything we've seen so far, including the excellent work at Johns Hopkins, is all about very easy computable data. And that's like numbers. But actually, the devil's in the detail of the more difficult coded data, which can be according to some ontology, like you were talking about, John, or it can be in free text, which is incredibly hard to get to grips with. So that's where that started. When I set that up, they said, oh, do you know there's a group around the corner at UCL, literally 2 minutes away from me, which I didn't know about, running a medical IT program. So we joined forces and we set up this platform for enhanced analytics and computational healthcare. Oh, sorry, I do mumble, I do mumble. Can we turn me up or should I just lean in a bit closer? Or I could just talk up. That'll do. Okay, so Peach, which is the easy way to pronounce it, is a set of lots of different projects based around medical IT. And within that, I tried to draw a map of everything we do. And these are different components there to cut it down. So there's different bits, so looking at data transfer, information sharing, identity management, analytics engines, storage, lots of different things. And then we started getting into the realms of AI. So this is the first thing. It's just, we've been lucky enough to be awarded a place at EMED Lab, the MRC group centered around here. And one of the first projects we're going to run on there is an analytics engine to suck out data from hospitals and use, so everything we work on usually in healthcare tends to be outdated technology from 10, 20 years ago, because we're that far behind. So what we've gone here is gone out to what's being used currently, open source. So all of these are open source software. We've been able to talk, because the open source community is so good, you can actually converse with the developers and get them to help you set it up. So we've got the first working prototype of it. In there, we're going to get MLlib, Apache Spark, to do the machine learning. We're nowhere near there, but we're close. Nowhere near, but close. Right. This is the other project we're doing. In Norway, there's a group of us within the IOTA Foundation. We've had the agreement set up between all the centers in the top right-hand corner to set up a regional health information sharing platform built on the blockchain buzzword. But there's a lot around that. That's a lot to do with GDPR, consent management, and actually the user. We won't call them a patient because they're a citizen, but it's the citizen controlling the data and who gets to see it. Another one of the EMED Lab projects is voice recognition, and this is being a bit scammy. What we're going to do here is set up TensorFlow, and we've done the first phase and used the pre-annotated data sets from YouTube and a few other places to train the models. So we end up getting a cheap voice recognition system for the NHS, which should be running on the servers here. And this one I always put up because it looks flash. So this was some work we've done with HoloLens. So this summer, it's looking, I'm the lead for regional, I'm the regional lead for renal cancer imaging. And part of it, we look at how you assess a kidney in a tumor pre-procedure and how you decide what kind of operation to do. So in this setup, we were taking the CT scans from a patient. So these aren't models, it's a patient CT scan, running it through a neural network, extracting segmenting out the different organs and the tumor, and then putting it back in, sending it into HoloLens so you can see it. But that worked quite well. So overall, you should think I'm a proponent of AI, but in the last year or two, there are some danger signs. And I've started to change my opinion on what I think. About a year ago, I thought that. The first danger sign is when someone uses the term disrupt. And if that's the case, there's usually a level of spin on top of what you're hearing. So that got me a bit worried. Then this man came along, Ali Parsai. And, and that's where we get into more dangerous territory, where you say, okay, don't worry about your doctor, folks. My robot, my AI will fix you, and it's going to be much, much better. Let's forget that you're raising some funds at the same time, but that raises some questions because we know how it works. This is Amazon. This is a company that spends millions, if not billions, on their search optimization and their recommendation platform, and it still gets stuff quite horrendously wrong. Quite simple stuff. We're not talking about complex patient pathways. We're talking about very simple, what do you want to buy? So if that's the level of granularity it can work at the moment with that much money chucked at it, I'm a bit hesitant to accept that it will be the future. So what could the future hold? What actually triggered this? This is the obligatory family shot. So you go, okay, you start having kids, and then that's their great-grandma, and you start thinking, okay, what happens when your kids become, well, when my kids become my age and when I become her age? What does it actually hold for society? And you start thinking a bit deeper. Then I got involved in this, the other buzzword, IOTA, which is a distributed ledger, which sounded good, and it still does, and it has a lot of uses, but one of its major aims is to say machines can communicate with each other, and they can request resources from each other and pay for it. So in a system where an AI can actually get resources very easily and have that secured across the world, then you've got to think, how powerful are you going to make these AIs? When you think about the danger in medicine, when you think about what effect it's going to have in medicine, actually, it's a reflection of what happens in the rest of society. So I think to get a clue of what's going to happen, we've got to look elsewhere and see what the problems could be. And there was a flashing thing, I should have said it at the start. These are all high-profile cases, but I'm not picking on anyone in particular. I think everyone's guilty of it. So there you go, flash. Exactly. So the first thing, is the training data good enough? So what did we learn in Open Cancer? No, it's not. So even when you're looking at coded data, anyone who's worked with hospital coded data knows it's wrong. I mean, the best example I have, I always say the story, is a patient advocate who used to work in a hospital in Northern Ireland, and we were at a big data conference together, and everyone's talking about how great big data is, how it's going to change the world. And she said, well, there was this one instance in her hospital, she used to work in the brain cancer unit, and one year, from one postcode, they had an outbreak of brain cancers. And everyone was thinking, there's something going on. Is it in the water, electricity pylon, something like that? After a long search, they found out it's because when the secretary who booked them in didn't know their postcode, she'd put her own postcode in. So that's the level of data integrity we're talking about here. So why do we know that? Because it's so obvious and it comes out. But if we only find that out because it's so bad, how many other bits of not so bad data are we counting on at the minute? So I think we're a long way till anything we build in this can actually be useful. Well, I think we all know what we're talking about here. How are people training their ML models, and what's the business model behind it? What are the ethics? So we've had a few cases, not just here, around the world, of people using data when they shouldn't have, and what are citizens' rights to that. We'll get to that probably in the panel discussion, so we won't dwell too long on that. And I think John Bell from Oxford wrote this piece on the fact that there's a lot of companies sniffing around the NHS, looking for data, promising breakthrough well, breakthroughs in all kinds of healthcare. But the reality is, once you give them the data, who owns the IP to it? Is it the NHS or is it the company? And that's what we've got to resolve to. So that boils down to how much the algorithm itself is worth versus how much the data is worth. And now lots of good algorithms are out there, open source. So we wonder, how much is the data actually worth now? Then we get to more fundamental questions. So we've talked about the input and how do we get data in. How do you process the data? So I think most people agree within a neural net and deep learning, it's very hard to audit what's happened to come to the results. So you put a whole bunch of data in, it analyzes and gives you a recommendation. How did it reach that? We don't know. And that's fine, but when you get to life or death decisions, maybe it becomes a bit more important. So some people say, look, we know we'll come to this because we'll train it with the right values. And when you're talking about something very simple, like person A here, do I, blood pressure down, give this drug, fine. But people are promising breakthroughs where you're looking at terabytes of data, population level data, and extrapolating it down to the individual. At that point, you've got to think, there have to be some values embedded in the system. So a paper came out a few months ago saying, the secret is saying, good job, this is the right thing to do, given two decisions. But actually, the reality is there isn't going to be two decisions. There's going to be about 1,000 different decisions that could be made. How do you enforce the right way all the time? Incredibly hard. Also, if you're talking about decisions, not just in medical applications, but in societal applications, what kind of values do you give it? So is it Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Russian, Chinese? Who knows? And do those values change over time? Yes, they do. So our values now are very different to what they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So in the future, do we still decide those values, or does the AI decide for us? This is a great one. Did anyone come across Taybot? Yeah, that was a great... So for people who don't know, Taybot was something that Microsoft released, I think, a year and a bit ago. And it was a chatbot on Twitter that pretended to be a millennial. And there's that group... People heard of 4chan? So 4chan are the trolls of the internet. They're the ones who make all the memes, like the Rick Astley stuff. I actually had a 4chan attack this week on IOTA, so that wasn't much fun, but they're known to go and try and muck things up. So the reason I put this up is it's actually very informative of what could happen. Taybot came out in the morning, 4chan knew about it. By the afternoon, they'd fed it with enough data that they knew would influence it a certain way, and it started out normal, and by the evening it was coming out with racist, Nazi, homophobic, sexist stuff, and it's that easy to do. So you go, well, will that manipulation actually ever happen? Well, Google has bought a whole bunch of biotech funds. Google's just been fined for manipulation of the search results. So this isn't a good or bad thing, it's a business decision. And this is what it boils down to. You have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders, and things like this happen. We have to decide what that means for society. And this is where it becomes a bit more complex. So if you look at most AI companies, there's a lot of liability involved. So they say, no, we're not telling you what to do. We're giving you a suggestion. It's decision support. You maintain the overall right to make this decision, and then we won't be sued for it, essentially. What happens over time? So the picture on the left is the landing on the Hudson, which is relevant because at that time he was a hero for landing that plane. The reality is, 10, 15 years ago, most people could have done that. But most pilots became de-skilled over time because the computer does most of the work. So you give an AI giving guidance most of the time and people will de-skill. We know that. So there's the de-skilling aspect. The other side is the liability. So we've talked about the AI companies not wanting to take it because that will hit their share price, in essence. But what happens if I'm seeing a patient and the decision support says, do this, I think it's the wrong thing and overrule it because ultimately it's my choice. What's the lawyer, what's the first thing they're going to say? Like, there's a decision support, so the patient dies, lawyer comes up and says, okay, this decision support system has seen millions of patients' records and gave you this choice, or gave you this recommendation, you've gone against it. How do you justify that? I think we're not that far away from that. And anyone who says it's just decision support is kind of kidding themselves. The next point, when do we actually move away from recommendation to automated decision making? And I was saying this to a few people before, I think these decisions are already being taken away from us. So if you look at your Facebook feed, it's a curated list of what it thinks it should show you. If you look at search results, it's the same. So with the fake news thing happening right now, anything that's labeled fake news, i.e. not straight down the mainstream, either too far left or too far right, is blocked. So on the one side, you'll have only very vanilla views shown. On the other side, you have something like Facebook, which only shows you things that reinforce your own views. And that's what lots of people think has happened in politics, where the left and the right don't speak to each other because your own views are reinforced again, rather than being challenged. So in a situation where the media is happening right now, where there's too much data for us to see and it's been curated, the same thing's going to happen with big data in medicine. So we will not be able to appreciate all the different data. It will be down to the AIs and the people who control the AIs who decide what we see. I always put this here. Are we creating systemic bias as a massive scale? So if a neural network decides that ginger people, I'm just going to pick ginger people, don't do so well with a certain drug, there's just something in the signal that told it that, and it makes that decision across the population, it's very hard to pick that up. Unless they all die, then it's obvious. But there's inherently a problem with systemic bias, and people will say, Navin, you yourself have biases, and it's true, we do. But my sphere of influence is very small. With these AIs, it's population-wide, and we've got to think how you fight these systemic biases, and in fact, how you find out about it if the actual processing on the inside is very opaque. Then we get onto the sticky situation of regulation in healthcare. So I was quite lucky this summer to be at a conference organized by the Association of Sustainable Medical Innovation, where we had small groups with the MHRA, NICE, all these people who are tasked with regulating it, and no one knows what to do. No one knows what to do because they don't know. They've not dealt with this before. America's now taking a much more laissez-faire attitude and saying, oh, we'll speed these up. No idea what's going to happen at the end of that. The reason I put Taybot in there is actually it's much more of a problem in ML, because what you sign off as being a good AI on Monday, by Tuesday may not, because it may have learned from more data sets. So if it's continuously learning, what you validate at one point is not the same algorithm that's in effect 2 days later. So how do we deal with that? Whenever we get to regulation, we always get to this, like, you can't stifle innovation. And this is a point I raise again and again. It's, are we stifling innovation or are we stifling profit? And I sometimes think it's the latter, and we'll get to why. So if you look at the business model for most AI startups, it tends to be make a model, get some data, train the model, sell it. Very rarely do they merge. Very rarely do they go down the IPO route or management buyout. It tends to be small company, make algorithms, sell to big company. And that kind of incentivizes the wrong kind of behavior. And what effect will that have? I think most people kind of accept that automation, robots, and AI are going to replace jobs. So I don't think there's much arguing with that. With the current market economy, you tend to have accumulation of wealth and IP at the top, offshored somewhere else, and then the rest of the population, the cumulative amount they own, keeps going down. So some people say, yeah, it's not, oh, we'll get to that. We'll get to why that's bad in a minute. Slightly all over this place, this talk. So what happens now if you have a whole bunch of smaller companies selling their IP to a big company? It's pretty much what happened in the media, in the internet. So you start with a whole group of companies and you end up with an oligopoly of 5, 10 at most that control everything. What happens when people get to control the data that you see from that point on? think we have precedents here, or president. This is what happens, in that you can manipulate people's emotions and voting if you can control what they see. And his campaign through Cambridge Analytica was pretty much that. Find out your political opinions and target the ad personally at you, which sounds like a good thing, but can also be a bad thing. A few other things. So there was this article a month or so ago. So a group that were published against the monopoly that Google had, and it's the same for Microsoft and Apple, every big company. It's not because they're evil, that's their job. But maybe we need to change that. Because at this point, when these companies are also funding the research of people who may criticize them, and then they get criticized, then they're going to stop them. And even more insidious is this kind of technology. So iPhone X yesterday, even better face recognition. Brilliant. What could that do? This kind of stuff. So what impact will that have on society? Don't know. So when we get down to it, what's the end game? So if we're saying AI is going to become quite important, you end up in two ways. So it's a dichotomy. Really benevolent AI, a bit of a plug, ends up in the Wall-E situation where there's an AI looking after the whole planet. In that movie, it made a bit of a mistake, but it's trying to do the best for the planet. It's trying to look after you. And that's AI being all-encompassing and taking over the world. The other option is something like the Hunger Games, where we've talked about accumulation of profit and IP at the top. And you have one group in society that lives separate to everyone else, lives well, and the rest fight for the scraps. And some people say, well, UBI is the answer, universal basic income. But actually, universal basic income is the scraps that are left at the end, after the stuff at the top has been taken away. And if that's forever decreasing, how do you fund a population on that? Concerning. So it all boils down to this. AI learns and evolves over time. Can we control it? Should we control it? And I'm not going to get into narrow, general superintelligence, but even with a narrow intelligence, which is given the wrong reinforcement algorithms, you can do bad. So the example that's usually given is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, or Fantasia here, where Mickey Mouse says, I want you broomsticks to fill my cauldron. And so that's their objective. So just fill my cauldron, keep it full. But actually get more broomsticks, and it keeps filling and floods the whole place. So it's unintended consequences of your reinforcement algorithms that say you can do other stuff. We can talk more about it in the panel chat. But so we're not saying it has to get to superintelligence. Even more so, lots of people have seen this, where they say, oh, yeah, humanity is going to change because everything's evolving at a more than exponential rate, and everything's just about to change, and things are going to get super intelligent. I don't think you need super intelligence, and that's what scares me about the IOTA stuff, is if you had a badly constrained, narrow AI with the ability to pull resources from across the world, that can do a lot of damage. So I think there's enough there to be worried about. And the last thing, I put this up as a joke the last time I gave this, it's like an international race for AI dominance. And it doesn't just have to be state actors, it could be ISIS, it could be anyone. Can all do it. And then Putin came out and said that. So there's a bit of validation to what I'm saying. I'm not completely nuts. So at the end of the day, this is what happens. People say, look, technology is amoral. You know, don't blame it, blame people. Well, so is a nuclear bomb. We still regulate that because we know it has the potential to harm. This is the point where people pretty much call me a tinfoil hat man. So I'll stop there. The only thing I want to mention is these three institutes. So people have probably heard of OpenAI. That's the one I'm a bit most dodgy of, because guess what? They're funded by the big companies. So maybe slightly biased. MIRI, a bit more, so Machine Intelligence Research Institute, they've got some really good videos on unconstrained AI as well. So if you're interested in that, have a look at that. And OpenMind is something I only came across 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it's a very different way. It's an open source way of doing distributed deep learning, but with people still in control of their data. I think that should be given a bit more attention. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions or reflections right now? And then we'll have a bit more time later if something comes to you later. Yeah, we've got 1, 2.
So I was very fortunate, this is Winhide, to hear and be part of a consortium that met at the Royal Society one day, and they brought in people from all over the world, and they asked the question, how do we regulate dual-use technologies? And the idea of, I didn't know what a dual-use technology was, but the idea is you have something like, a synthetic DNA system where you can build particular genes for good, but what happens if that gets into the wrong hands? And, there was quite a lot of discussion. The Royal Society came out with a paper. I'm sure it went somewhere that, But the point is, Peter Silston was there, and he said an important thing, which I'm very much an open access advocate as well. And basically, there was a small group in the room that said, if you make this open access and you reveal as much of the technology as possible, that actually is a good thing, because it allows, as you mentioned in the Open Mind Initiative, it allows there to be a counterpart to the development of these quote-unquote bad things. And you see that in cybersecurity, where cyber specialists publish the worst of the worst tools, because then, of course, their exploits can be countered. And I wondered if you had a comment on that in the AI community. Is there an equivalent to that distribution of knowledge such that all can contribute to its countering its rather unpleasant effects? Thank you.
I mean, this is the big question. And when you say, should we regulate it, the immediate answer is, no, we shouldn't, because another country will take the lead. And they could be a bad country. And we don't want evil people doing that. We're not going to get to the definitions of evil, because that varies across the world and according to your political affiliation. So let's go away from that. We can say, is everything fine as long as it's open? To an extent, yes. But I think there's a deeper issue here, which is not necessarily the technology itself. We've said that's kind of amoral. And if we say, okay, we won't regulate it, I think another option is to change the incentives. So if you disincentivize people to take shortcuts, so I was mentioning it before, the venture capital model right now says you get a bit of venture capital funding, get some data quickly, try and do the most effective algorithm you can by a year's time and sell it. And that's what your valuation is. In that, you're not going to build proper constraints there. So you're incentivizing people to build bad systems. So I think stopping everyone's going to be incredibly hard to do, but actually changing the, if you want to call it gamification, whatever, change the incentives of people to do it the right way. I think that's the only really scalable option.
Okay, one more question if there is one. Yeah.
Thank you. Savi Eastdale, hi. I wondered whether there's precedence anywhere. I was thinking about the Human Genome Project, where, there was a race to get, who's going to get there first. Multiple institutions were working very hard, and then, things changed and there was collaboration. I mean, obviously there's more now that we're seeing, but do you think that we can look at examples? Can you think of any other examples that we can, learn from and apply the same thing to the multiple institutions, or not?
So if you look now, so if you say that was before when the world was a better place, and you look now and say what's happening with CRISPR and other technologies, IP is everything. And actually, I think it's because the model that, I don't want to get back down to like fractional reserve banking and actually the current economic climate, but that's essentially what it boils down to. If the economic system promotes that kind of behavior and it's only getting worse, this is the kind of behavior you're going to get. So I don't think this is necessarily a technology issue. Like I said, I take it all back. Yes, it is amoral, but actually, yes, we still do have to regulate it in some way, and that regulation may not be direct regulation of the AI, but of what's happening in the economy around it. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Do we have time to take one more now? Or yeah, one more.
Sorry, I don't want to delay. I just had to say that the open clinical concept is about ownership of the IP, ownership of the power of medicine in the knowledge of how to deliver good care. And we have the aspiration not only to have that ownership outside Open Clinical as an organisation, but to promote debate, discussion, engagement with all the stakeholders, the professionals and the patients, in constantly reviewing that open knowledge base.
Yeah,
Do you think that's a sensible, if difficult, objective?
So there's a few initiatives like that. So with the Open Council, we're working with something called Open Air, Open EHR. There's FIRE. There's a few initiatives talking about public ownership of the data models and being able to work with it very easily. The problem again boils down to the vendors. And each time you build a system like this, which works in isolation by itself, the problem is you have to then integrate it with a proprietary software solution. And the last thing they want you to do is disrupt their business model. So that's where we've had lots of troubles trying to institute what's actually a really great project into the hospital, because the proprietary connections are impossible. And they make it hard, because why wouldn't you?